Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see new faces and old faces. This is a 5-part series, and it's a very personal approach based on my own experience and my own religious struggles with the spirituality of pain and suffering. Last week we basically laid the groundwork for the next 4 lectures, in which I just basically tried to outline what were the issues from a basically phenomenological basis, that is, the experience of pain and the difference between pain, anguish, and suffering. Today I want to take a more personal tack and to outline the trajectory of my own thinking and how it has moved in my own life from philosophical to theological to spiritual. And that really brings me back to my own childhood, where growing up in the London borough of Finchley, Margaret Thatcher was my MP. And on Shabbos afternoon in 1966, for about a year or two, I would gather at the home of a friend, Robert Reiner, and another friend, Jonathan Sachs, and another friend, Shimon Abramsky, whose father was the curator of the University College library, the Jewish library there. And then Barry Schechter, who's actually now a rabbi in Skokie. And the 4 of us would meet every Shabbos afternoon. And they were about 3 or 4 years ahead of me. They were all in Cambridge, and they would come down, and we would sit there for 3 or 4 hours and discuss basically what I have now come to understand is the problem of theodicy. The word theodicy, T-H-O-D-I-C-Y, comes from the word in Greek theos, which means God, and dike, which means justice. And so theodicy is the attempt by scholars, religious and philosophers and mystics, to resolve the evidential problem of evil by reconciling the traditional divine characteristics of omnibenevolence and omnipotence. So we're going to talk about that. The philosophy that I was introduced to as a 16-year-old by these colleagues, really older boys. I was in the 6th form, and they were already in, they had gone up to Cambridge, was the notion of how is it possible to be religious and believe in a divine God who is good, and at the same time tolerate evil. And they would go back and forth. And they were the ones that got me started reading, and I started reading Erich Fromm and George Steiner at the time. And at that point, my parents let me go to my first movie at age 16. It was called Trial at Nuremberg. And I saw pictures there and images that I'd never, as a child, seen, and became obsessed with the whole Holocaust issue. Man's inhumanity to man in the face of God's passivity. And that really troubled me in the 7th and the upper 6th form, and actually influenced my choice of yeshiva, because most of the boys in my class, if they were right-wing, went to Gateshead, which is the Lakewood equivalent in the United Kingdom. And if they were Zionists, they went to Kerem B'Yavneh in Israel. And both of those were not choices for me, precisely because I wanted to explore the philosophical issues of pain and suffering. And so I went to Rav Kook Yeshiva, America's Rav, because I had read some writings of his. And it was there that I went from the philosophical to the next phase, which is the theological, and spent my year in Eretz Yisrael half day learning Gemara, but half day in the library of Hebrew Union College, reading the whole set of Tradition magazine from 1950 till 1966, as well as Conservative Judaism and Judaism magazine, which is the American Jewish Congress. And in those articles, I had become now acquainted with the American Jewish scholars, like your teachers, Heschel, and Lichtenstein, and Soloveitchik, and Norman Lamb, and I mean, all these people became friends to me. You know, I was just bathed in those talks and those articles. And that theological approach, which means how does someone well-rooted in the Jewish tradition deal with this problem, not from a philosophical aspect, but from a theological aspect, was the next stage of my trajectory. And it was here that I started studying Midrash and ending up with a PhD in the King Mashalim in Eicha Rabbah, which is the way the rabbis dealt with catastrophe in the 4th century, meaning looking back at Lamentations and commentating on Lamentations, which was written much earlier to do with the Churban and the destruction of the temple. Here they were 400 years later looking back at that and saying, well, how do we make sense of it? We lost the temple, we lost Eretz Israel, here we are in exile, and is our God a good God? Is our God a willful God? How do we deal with it? They didn't deal with it in a philosophical way, the way the later medievalists will do, like the Rambam and the Ramban, all the way down to the Maharal and pre-modern times. They dealt with it in the true midrashic way. Mashal lema hadavar domeh. What can it be compared to? A king who has a son who he loves very much, and he takes him to the altar to get him married. Sorry, the chuppah. And under the chuppah, the king has a rage attack and strikes the child and kills him. And now he sits in the shiva and he is makonein. He is wailing like Lamentations and saying, woe is to my son who went to a foreign culture and inspired my rage. It's his fault. And then he had a second son, and he took him to the chuppah, and he had another rage attack, and he hit him and struck him, and he died. First chuppah, first Beis Hamikdash. Second chuppah, second Beis Hamikdash. Now the king sits on the ground and says, Kiru li mekonanim, bring me the dirge singers, the women who wail. Why? Woe is to me. Woe is now to me, not to him. It's clear that I have to deal with rage. I have a problem. Woe is to me that I don't know how to deal with my sons. Now that's just a story, but the implication of that story in the Midrash is, you can blame the first temple on us. You know, okay, we were bad guys, so you destroyed the temple. Well, when you get to the second temple, it's becoming a little bit of a pattern here. And the whole of Jewish history seems to be one recurring pattern of crime and punishment. Well, maybe there's something wrong with the all-powerful Almighty. Now, that could never be said outright. So it is caged and couched in the mashal, in a, thank you so much, in the guise and the poetics of a parable, right? And that, for me, was a wonderful way of working my thesis through. And in the last chapter, I tried to suggest, could we learn from that catastrophe, that pain and that suffering, a theodicy that would apply to the Holocaust in terms of a trajectory of how would we write a midrash for our day? Now, people have looked at that, like Fackenheim, the scholar, has written a modern Bible commentary based on that kind of consciousness. So that, for me, was the trajectory that I was following, until I came to the third section, which I called the spiritual, when I discovered that, Midrash had suddenly gone underground after the medieval period. Where did it surface, The Rambam had dissed it, and it kind of went underground. I mean, we have Medrash HaGodel, we have the Yalkut, but those are just likutim. They're not really, they're not new Medrash, and they're just collections of old Midrashim. And then I discovered it in Polish Chassidut. In the Polish Chassidut of the Ishbitz and the Sfas Emes and the Shem Mishmuel and Reb Tzadok HaKohen, in these writings, they would pick up on a Medrash and then run with it with this new kind of Hasidic identity from the Baal Shem HaKodesh. And it was here that I started to look for and search for what would these Hasidic masters talk about when they discussed pain and suffering. And that brought in the Kabbalistic notions, which we will come to in a subsequent talk, of the Tzimtzum and the divine absence and the Shekhinah, the consciousness of the Shekhinah being separate but yet within the divine, split from the divine, searching for the divine, so there being a split within the divine, picking up on that Lurianic idea of a catastrophe within the divine that we then participate as adepts. So that forms the outline of the three stages in terms of my development and my trajectory. In the fourth part, which is where I'm at right now, I hope to bring you some writings from Simon Weil. Post-Hasidic masters means those who are open to modernity and yet informed by the spirit of Hasidut. And, of course, the David Weiss Halivni-Wiesel connection. They both came from Sigurd, they both went to concentration camps, they're both still friends to this day, they're both in their late 80s. And I've gone very close to David Weiss Halivni, and his book, Breaking the Tablets, is the first attempt by someone within traditional Talmudic scholarship to really come out with something quite radical. Okay, let's go back to the philosophical. Last week we talked about the spirituality of pain and suffering. We can't talk about that without first talking about the philosophy and the theology to bring us to that point of spirituality. Because that, for me, is the development that I took. I want to start with a poem by Elizabeth Drew Barstow. I should be happy with my lot, a wife and mother. Is it not enough for me to be content? What other blessing could be sent? A quiet house and homely ways that make each day like other days. I only see time's shadow now, darken the hair on baby's brow. No world's work ever comes to me, no beggar brings his misery. I have no power, no healing art, with bruised soul or broken heart. I read the poets of the age, 'tis lotus eating in a cage. I study art, but art is dead to one who clamors to be fed with milk from nature's rugged breast, who longs for labor's lusty rest. Oh, foolish wish, I still should pine if nay other lot were mine. I'll repeat the last word. Oh, foolish wish, I still should pine if nay other lot were mine. What is she saying right at the end? I'd still be complaining whatever I'd be doing, right? That's my lot, as being happy. It's an amazing poem. It really struck me. Because there's suffering even in the ordinary. There's this kind of anguish, Everything is present. She has everything. She's got a quiet house, homely ways. Every day is like every other. There's no threat. There's no threat, right? And there is babies, and there's... She doesn't have to work for her living, right? And yet, there's something gnawing, aching, deep inside her, clamoring to be fed with the milk from nature's rugged breast. That ruggedness that's not present in her domesticated life. And I was just very moved by that poem. In the philosophy of religion, the problem of evil is the very question of how to reconcile the existence of evil with a God who is both omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, and omniscient, meaning all-knowing. Because if God knows about the evil that's occurring, then he could do something about it. If he doesn't know, then he's not omnipotent and is not all-powerful. So you're in a philosophical bind that's happened all the time, all the way back from the Greek philosophers such as Epicurus to the present. A wide range of responses have been given to the problem of evil. So you can explain that God's act of creation and God's act of judgment are the same. Or you can say God is viewed as good because his judgment of evil is a good judgment. Or that the explanation of evil is the result of free will misused by God's creatures. Classic Jewish and Christian response. All right. The logical problem that occurred all the way from Epicurus until we came to the end of philosophy with Wittgenstein in the 1930s is, one, if an all-powerful and perfectly good God exists, then evil doesn't. Two, there is evil in the world. Three, therefore, an all-powerful and perfectly good God does not exist. And I remember as a child with these guys, this was going back and forth and back and forth. God exists. God is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good. A perfectly good being would want to prevent all evil to his creatures. An omniscient being knows every way in which evil comes into existence. An omnipotent being who knows every way in which an evil comes into existence has the power to prevent that evil from happening. So a being who knows every way in which evil comes into existence, who is able to prevent the evil from coming into existence, and who wants to do so, would do so. He would prevent the existence of that evil. So, if there exists an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being, then no evil exists. But evil does exist. Logical contradiction. So, this is known in philosophical circles as the logical problem of evil. Okay. The defenders of theism, meaning those who believe in a God, argue that God could very well exist and allow evil. Why? In order to achieve a greater good. And that will be the apologetic response of most theologians from Augustine down to the Jewish theologians. Again, the definition of theodicy is theos, which means God, and dike, which means justice. Theodicy, the justice of God. That notion of theodicy starts really with Augustine in response to Epicurus. Now remember, Epicurus was the Greek philosopher, so we're about 2nd century BCE. And it's very interesting that in the Talmud, the word for heretic is an apikoros, or an epicurus. And I have made the outrageous claim that when the Gemara in Chagiga says that 4 entered the paradise, 4 scholars entered the paradise, it was interpreted later as the paradise of mystical speculation. One of them was Rabbi Akiva. He went in and came out perfect. No change, didn't get hurt. One of them was Ben Azai and Ben Zoma. One went mad and one committed suicide. And the last one was Elisha ben Avuya, who went in and came out an Epicurean. So I made the outrageous claim that when they went into the paradise, The paradise is nothing other than a paradise. A paradise is an orchard. Between Epicurus' academy and his house, there was an orchard where he would meet his students. So I believe that they entered into the speculative theology or theosophy or philosophy of Epicurus' school. Now, Epicurus says that God and evil cannot coexist. The notion of Epicurus is that there is no judge and no justice. How do we know that? From his writings. What happened to Elisha ben Avuya? The Medrash says that he saw a boy listening to his father. His father says, climb up that tree and bring me that esrog. So he climbs up the tree and he climbs onto a branch, fulfilling the command, listen to your father, honor thy father and thy mother. And in response to that, which is promised long life, what does he do? The father says, sorry, not to pick up an esrog, he says to him, shoo away the mother bird. Shooing away the mother bird is the only other mitzvah in the Torah in which you're promised long life. So he goes up, honoring his mother and his father. He shoos away the mother and bird. In both of those, he's promised long life, and he drops it, and the branch cracks, and he falls and breaks his head. When Elisha ben Avuya sees that happening, he pronounces, let din v'let dayan. There is no God and there is no justice. He sees the suffering of the child who does perform the will of his father in conformance with both mitzvot of honoring parents and shooing away the mother bird, in which you are promised long life on this world. Of course, the rabbi said, no, it didn't mean in this world, it meant the world to come. So I consider Epicurus the father of this kind of speculative philosophy. And one of our great Amoraim, Elisha ben Avuya, falls prey to that speculative philosophy and gives up halacha and Torah and mitzvot. And the story goes that one day he was walking with his disciple Rabbi Meir on Shabbat, and he's on his horse, and Rabbi Meir is walking, and they are talking still until he gets to the Tchum Shabbat. And Rabbi Meir and Elisha ben Avuya says to his teacher, Rabbi Meir, you can't go any further. I can drive, but you can't. You have to turn back and walk home. And Rabbi Meir still tries to say, listen, come back with me. Right? He tries to bring him back. And a voice comes from heaven, says, right, Shuvu bonim shovim, everyone may return and do penitence, chutz mi'acha, except from Elisha ben Avuya. Very dark, because teshuva is for everybody. Everyone, the bas kol says, except Elisha. So he was obviously a threat upstairs, right, with his attack. But that is the school of Epicurus, which says you can't stay frum and have theodicy. It's just not logically makes sense. So what would be the response of theologians to the problem of theodicy? The term theodicy actually, very interesting, was coined very late by Leibniz. Leibniz had seen the Lisbon earthquake actually Voltaire had written a poem on the poem sur le désastre de Lisbonne, the poem on the Lisbon disaster. Apparently the massive destruction of that earthquake of innocent lives demonstrated, at least to Voltaire and to Leibniz, that God was not providing the best of all possible worlds. Here, these philosophers had actually witnessed what was going on in Lisbon. And for Leibniz, there was no rational solution to the problem of evil. That means Leibniz, the great philosopher, is telling us that if you want to stay frum, if you want to be religious, if you want to be a theist, you have to surrender your brain. You have to surrender the intellect and the logical mind, because you could no longer be rational in your faith in the divine, because philosophically it doesn't make sense. I want to bring the Iranian Theodicy. Irenaeus died in 202, very early Christian fourth father. And he suggests, which is mirrored in some of our Chazal, that existence of evil is necessary for human development. Human creation comprised of two parts. Humans were made in the image and likeness of God, and that is the potential to achieve moral perfection. In order to achieve moral perfection, you require free will. And in order to have free will, you must experience suffering, and God must be distant from humanity. This is the Iranian theodicy which affected a lot of the later thinkers. Now in 1998, a Jewish theologian, Zachary Breiterman, coined the term Ante Theodicy in his book God After Auschwitz. Right? When they put God on trial and they find him guilty, what's the next thing they do? Daven Ma'ariv. Breiterman writes that an anti-theodicy rejects the idea that there is a meaningful relationship between God and evil, or that God could be justified for the experience of evil. Most of the Hasidic writers after the Holocaust are anti-theodicy. They refuse to have evil to do anything with the Ribono Shel Olam. Evil must come from man. Unless you say everything comes from the Ribono Shel Olam, then nothing makes sense. Right? So man, in humanity to man, man causes evil to man. Man has the free will to do evil. Therefore, all evil is as a result of man. What's the problem with that? Earthquakes, disasters, volcanoes, right? The problem is, what about the stuff that's not caused by man? David Blumenthal, the professor, I think he's at Emory, writes a book. Did you take classes with him?
Sure did, yeah.
Okay. Facing the Abusing God. And he supports the theology of protest. That's the Wiesel's approach. The theology of protest. And that's which I think that is picks up on what I was saying in the Midrash of Eicha Rabbah. Couched in the Mashal is a kind of theology of protest, right? You're not actually criticizing God, but the Mashal is definitely, as the writer is projecting the character of the king, and I myself go into that. That is, what's the character of this guy who kills his son, or who has a rage attack with his wife, and what does he do? He banishes her from the kingdom, but he doesn't give her a get. Now wait a minute. If you don't want her anymore, so give her a get and let her free. Now he gets rid of her. She has to leave the castle, but he refuses to give her a get. We have a lot of this in Israel going on, fortunately. Right? It's very mean. But that's brought in the Midrash. So she wanders around and says, Adoni HaMelech, excuse me. If you don't want me, set me free. And if you want me, take me back. But you've got me in this kind of purgatory, right? Now, in that is a protest, Moshel, right? If you want to send the Jews out of Israel into exile, so let us go and be like all the Goyim. Let us just become like them and intermarry and just assimilate. What's this business that we still have to keep the Torah and mitzvahs? So on the one hand, you kicked us out of Israel, you took away the base of Mikdash, but you still want us to be married to you. So we got no one to get... So there is already this notion of theology of protest. When it comes to the theological and theodicy, no one describes it better than Clifford Geertz, G-E-R-T-Z. He writes an essay called Religion as a Cultural System, and he writes as a sociologist and anthropologist. So he explores what he calls the cultural dimension of religion, defining culture as a historically transmitted pattern of meanings. So how does religion construct and sustain symbolic networks? I mean, that's after all what we're doing. Christianity has its own frame of symbolic networks in which people buy into that. Geertz recognizes the innate human desire for meaning. And we see this even in Auschwitz, right? Once they lost meaning to their suffering, we're told by the biographers and the diarists that very soon they were gone. As long as you held on to meaning, there was, and we had this guy coming here. I asked him to speak to you about his experience in the labor camps, and you know, those who held on to finding a bit of flour to make a matzah, or building a little tiny sukkah, right? They held on to life, the others didn't. But in a darker frame, Geertz sees that religion seeks a plausible and authoritative cosmic order that orients human existence. The notion that religion tunes human actions to an envisioned cosmic order and projects images of cosmic order onto the plane of human experience isn't new. Religion generates cosmic schemes that enable believers to make sense of the world. This idea that it doesn't matter if there's evil taking place or suffering to me, as long as I can make sense of it, I'm okay. And I said before, patients of mine who have belief systems suffer better. They don't need so much Vicodin. That's how I tell, by the way. It's very clear. How many pills of Vicodin you need a month? And the ones that have a core belief system, or realize why they're suffering, or realize that they're suffering for the purpose of the Lord or the divine, or they don't need it so much. They don't need it so much. They have an ordered meaning that generates a cosmic scheme that enables them to make sense of the world and their suffering. So, when disaster strikes, when cancer strikes, when illness strikes, when catastrophe, family breakups, human suffering, torture, what happens? Religion must restore cosmic meaning through theodicy. We've got to have a reason why God is doing this to me, or why is God tolerating the evil that's happening to me. So, Geertz then, his understanding of the problem of evil is based on his definition of religion. Remember, we discussed his definition of culture. His definition of religion is a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in men by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence and clothing these conceptions with an aura of factuality. I thought that's absolutely brilliant. So you develop this whole system of symbols, which are powerful, pervasive, long-lasting. They affect you, your mood, and your motivation. And they are so powerful that those conceptions give an aura of fact, as if this is the truth out there. He's writing in a post-truth world, a postmodern world, where you can look back at the Enlightenment and say, well, yeah, I know you felt that that was the truth of existence. 1 and 1 makes 2. An atom cannot be split. There is good and there's evil and they don't interact, right? But from a post-Holocaust, post-Enlightenment world, that we are now looking back at this whole experiment of the Enlightenment, starting with Louis XIV and Napoleon, and the whole intellectual Enlightenment project, capitalism, the use of goods and the use of psychology, right? Now looking back at that very critically, we can say, well, what did you do? Basically, you took what the church had been saying for 1,000 years, you know, there's good, there's evil, you get punished for the evil you do, you get rewarded for the good, right? All these which were considered completely to be absolutely the foundations of life. And you slogged them up in the Enlightenment. You said, no, I must use the rational mind. Right? All the rational mind of the Italian Renaissance and the French Enlightenment was brought down to bear and banished God and banished religion in the name of science and industry and technology and modernity. Now we're looking at that because we say, well, that also brought Auschwitz and Hiroshima. So man's inherent goodness didn't stop him from using technology to kill 100 million people in the 20th century. Oh, so what did he do? He just substituted the facts and motivations of the church and substituted them with science and technology. So religious symbols for Geertz provide a sense of orientation in the ultimate sense, meaning how to come to terms with ultimate significance of one's place in the world. And the operative word here is order. Religion creates the space for a sacred mode of existence by making unintelligible intelligible, by making that which is meaningless to be meaningful. So what does religion do for Geertz? And this is the punchline. It filters the disorder